Yes, good afternoon, brothers and sisters. We are more than pleased and happy and delighted that you're joining us again for another segment with Milton Allimadi. As you know, Milton is both he produces Black Star News. He's a professor at John in the African Studies Department of John J. College of Criminal Justice. Um, he is an award-winning writer who has won awards for his brilliant, in-depth reporting on Africa in particular. But Milton, we're just glad to be back with you again. We've been doing a series on Africa, the new scramble for Africa, and we looked at the basis of the first scrambler, which is really a period after Africans have had brought the basis of our fundamental understanding of how the universe operates.
That's right.
Before other people, other races were coming out of the caves of Europe. And we brought that up all the way to the Greeks and Roman involvement in our Kemetic ancient African civilization. So I'd like to turn it over to you, Milton, to kind of bring us up to date and
Absolutely
continue.
Yes, it's always my pleasure to be on your show, brother. And thank you for the good work that you continue to do and to shed knowledge to our African communities everywhere. And thank you for this platform. Back in the day, we couldn't disseminate this knowledge so widely. So thank you for this online platform now. So we walked through and we reached in our last discussion the scramble for Africa, the Berlin Conference, the partition of Africa, the resistance. We discussed that. We want our young African people to know that Africans resisted colonial rule. So we discussed that. And then nevertheless, at least by 1914, most resistance had been subdued and Europeans were controlling Africa and its great resources. And Europeans have essentially set up Africa like a plantation where they could get the resources for their factories. And then they also had a captive market. So now they can force their products from their factories for Africans to consume. And obviously they exploited the labor of Africans on the farms, the land that they seized. We discussed how Africans were displaced from their land and Europeans took over the land. And another thing that we didn't mention, but which we should mention today, is the most destructive thing that Europeans did was to reorientate the economic production system in African countries. Africans used to grow their own food, and any surplus they had, they would trade with other African countries. Africans had started manufacturing, so that if you look at the history, textile, clothes made in the United Kingdom were second rate compared to textile that were produced in African countries, such as what is now today modern Angola, what was then the Kingdom of Congo, and parts of Nigeria. They produced superior textile, and Ghana as well. But when the Europeans came, they destroyed any indigenous manufacturing that Africans had initiated. They destroyed entrepreneurial companies that Africans had initiated. And once they set up the colonial regime, one of the things they did was to ban financial institutions from lending money to African enterprises, so that the Africans who once owned their own companies ended up having to work as employees for companies that were now owned either by Europeans or the middle middlemen that were invited to African countries by Europeans. So in West Africa, there were Lebanese, for example. And in East Africa, there were mostly Indians or Pakistanis. So Asians became like the middlemen. Africans were now forced to produce what the economies of Europe needed, not what Africans needed. So for example, in Mozambique, the Portuguese colonies, they were forced to grow cotton. Now you can't eat cotton. They were forced to abandon of their own food. So when they had a collapse in the global price of cotton, and now Africans had no money because nobody's buying the cotton, and Africans had no food because they were compelled to grow cotton and neglect producing their own food. And in the past, while it was bad, at least they would have a little money from the cotton to buy food. But now you have a situation where you have no money, you have no food, you have no money to buy food. So thousands, tens of thousands of Africans died as a result of being forced into economic structure and system that forced them not to grow food. In some of the French colonies, they were even banned from hunting. So Africans could not even go and hunt for game to eat, to sustain themselves. It was made illegal.
I sent you an invitation.
So if you were found hunting, you would actually be prosecuted. So that is the most destructive thing that European colonialism did to Africa's economy. And that is pretty much the system that exists even today in the 21st century. That is why all African countries produce what they call primary commodities. These are raw materials that goes into the factories in Europe, you see? And they're dependent on importing manufactured products from Europe that are sold at prices that are highly inflated compared to what they sell to Europe. And that is why, so long as that system exists, if it's not changed, Africans will perpetually be impoverished, even though the continent is so richly endowed with mineral resources. So now let me move toward some of the impetus that led to the independence struggle in African countries when Africans moved to get away from European colonial rule. In addition to this economic enslavement that I just described, what Europeans did was also to use African bodies, African lives, to fight in their own wars in Europe. So for example, in World War I alone, and I don't even know why it's called World War I, it was not an African war. Africans had nothing to do with it. More than 2 million Africans were conscripted as part of the British or the French Empire to go and fight in Europe in a war whose causes the Africans didn't even know. The same thing in World War II. Millions of Africans conscripted to go and fight in Europe against Hitler. Africans didn't know what the issue was. They didn't know what the issue between Germany and England and France and their allies, and later on the United States, was about. What did it have to do with Africans who had been minding their own business in Africa? Nonetheless, they were conscripted and forced to go and fight, and hundreds of thousands of Africans died on behalf of Europe in World War I and World War II, and largely they were forgotten. After they went back to their countries, they went back again to being treated like third, and in Kenya, as one European said, fifth-class citizens of their own countries. And then this experience of fighting on behalf of Europe in the world wars dramatically changed the mindset of Africans. Number one, all the myth of white supremacy was immediately dispelled because they saw that Europeans could be cowards on the front line, and some could be brave. But all feared death as well. In other words, there was nothing special about Europeans. And the aura of white supremacy that they'd been disseminating in Africa all went out the door, particularly at the end of the day, when the Africans realized that had it not been for their own sacrifice on behalf of Europe, the European countries that had conscripted them would have lost that war, regardless of which side they were fighting on. So this is when the Africans started saying, you know what, enough is enough. We're not going back to being fifth-class citizens. So in Ghana, for example, the veterans of the World War II, they went to the governor's mansion and they wanted to deliver a petition saying, enough is enough. We want our rights. And the European police force with African officers commanded by Europeans fired into this unarmed group of veterans just coming to deliver a petition. And many of them were killed. And that led to uprising. It sparked uprising in Ghana. And eventually, Kwame Nkrumah started becoming very prominent as a result of these uprisings that started after World War II. Nkrumah was eventually locked up, and he was charged with treason and being responsible for these uprisings. But the uprisings continued, and Britain saw the writing on the wall that we either would lose it all or we have to make a preemptive move and start opening the door for Africans to enter into leadership and for Europeans to depart. So they had an election for internal government in Ghana. Kwame Nkrumah was still in jail, but even while he was in jail, he was elected, he won, and his party won, the Convention People's Party, and he had to be released by the British. And he formed the first government of internal rule, meaning they pretty much ran the state except for foreign affairs and except for control of the army. And then a few years later, Nkrumah led Ghana, which had been the Gold Coast, and then became Ghana, to independence in 1957. And he was the first prime minister and later president. Now let's look at what happened in Kenya. In Kenya, the Africans that came back from World War II also said the same thing. Enough is enough. They had learned how to operate modern weapons. They had learned how to assemble and make weapons. So some of them went into the forest and they created what they call the Kenya Land and Freedom Army. Very specific. They knew what they wanted. They wanted the land back, the 4 million acres that had been stolen from Africans and given to 1,000 European families. And they wanted freedom. They wanted independence. And the British demonized them and called them Mau Mau. Nobody even knows the origins or the meaning of the word. But it was just meant to provoke that image of savage, barbaric Africans just wanting to kill Europeans for no reason. But the name that they gave to themselves lets you know that they had a specific agenda, that no issue with Europe or Europeans. They wanted their land, they wanted their independence, and that's why they took up arms. And eventually they won. because it was their struggle that led to Kenya's independence in 1963. But the British, ever very crafty, ever very cunning, did the same thing they did in Ghana. Rather than lose outright on the battlefield, the British started opening the door. They paved the way for the elite, the Kenyan elite, people like Jomo Kenyatta. So the British had a handshake deal with Kenyatta, and Kenyatta became the first prime minister and later president of Kenya. But the actual brothers and sisters who did the fighting and hid in the forest, and many of them perished, many of them died, including one of the most renowned of their leaders, Dedan Kimathi. He was captured in 1957 and executed by hanging. And people that don't know Dedan Kimathi, I encourage you, I urge you to do the research. Dedan is D-E-D-A-N, that's his first name. Kimathi, K-I-M-A-T-H-I. So after the elite in Kenya took over the government and created the African government now, they cut out the Kenyan Land and Freedom Army, the survivors of the struggle. They shunned them. They created distance between the new elite and the people that did the actual fighting, the people that wanted the land reform, return the land that had been stolen from their ancestors. So now you have an African government in Kenya with an African president serving the interest of empire. So even though Kenya got its independence in 1963, as we speak today, in 2021, the land reform has never occurred in Kenya. So that much of the land is still owned by Europeans, some of them in Kenya, some of them absentee landlords, some of them not even alive anymore, but belonging to their descendants in Europe. And the Africans in Kenya are still starving for land as we speak today in 2021. Some of the elite in Kenya, including the first prime minister and president, Jomo Kenyatta, became one of the biggest landowners in Kenya and one of the wealthiest Kenyans. And his son today, Uhuru Kenyatta, is the president of Kenya today. And he and his family are also the richest Kenyans and the largest landowners in Kenya. Now, let me talk a little bit about other African countries where the struggle was a bit different, where they actually fought almost all the way, but not all the way. Europeans never allowed Africans to fight all the way. And that is important. And I'll tell you why it's important. It is important if you fight all the way because you then set the new agenda on how you want your country to operate. It wasn't a question of the United States fighting a revolutionary war against Britain, and then Britain saying, oh, no, let's stop fighting now. Come to London and we'll set up the terms of your independence. No, they fought and declared independence because they wanted to set up the vision of what type of United States they wanted to follow after independence. But in the case of African countries, almost all of them went to the capital of the former colonial power to negotiate the terms of dispensation. So now you have the colonial power helping to create the state that is supposed to succeed the colonial power. So nobody should be surprised that up today in the 21st century, Africa is not really free. Africa is not really independent. So now let me talk about the other countries that I said I want to talk about. Namibia included, Angola included, Mozambique included, Guinea-Bissau included. In these countries, Africans seized arms because the Europeans did not want to even negotiate. In Kenya, yes, at some point they negotiated. In Ghana, they negotiated. But in Mozambique, Angola, Guinea-Bissau, which were Portuguese colonies, the Portuguese did not want to negotiate. And it's not surprising. Portugal is one of the poorest countries in Europe. And Portugal said, no way, we're not giving up all these riches in Africa. We're already a poor country, we'll become even a poorer country in Europe. So that's why they didn't want to negotiate independence. They resisted. So the Africans had to take up arms. They had to train. They created liberation movements. For Namibia, it was SWAPO. And the leaders included people like Sam Nujoma, who was based for many years right here in New York City, in Harlem. He got to know a lot of sisters and brothers, including you yourself, Brother Clemson Brown. And
Yes.
other countries like Mozambique, we had Frelimo. Frelimo was created by leaders such as Eduardo Mondlane, who was the first African in Mozambique to get a college degree. And in order to do it, he had to leave his country and come all the way to the United States to get a college degree. He got his undergrad here, he got his master's, and he got his PhD. And then he said, I'm going to use my education on behalf of my people. So they created Frelimo. But the Portuguese, unfortunately, managed to get to him. They assassinated Mondlane when he was in Tanzania. Julius Nyerere, one of my heroes, the late Julius Nyerere, president of Tanzania, invited Nujoma. He said, leave the United States and come to Tanzania. I'll give you a base where you can have your headquarters for Frelimo, where you can train your soldiers to fight against Portuguese colonialism. So he went, they started creating and building this army, and they started hitting the Portuguese in Mozambique. But unfortunately, the Portuguese intelligence managed to sneak a letter bomb to him, and it somehow got past his security. And that bomb took the life of Eduardo Mondlane. And then Samora Machel became the leader of Frelimo, and they continued the fighting. And Samora Machel, he had been the military commander, so now he became the leader of the political wing as well of Frelimo. And they fought the Portuguese, and the Portuguese sustained so many losses that they got tired of fighting. And in 1974, the Portuguese army in Portugal overthrew the Portuguese government because that's how much they'd been defeated in Africa. So they overthrew the government, and they said, now we're willing to talk. So they negotiated, and they ended Portuguese colonial rule in Mozambique. In Angola, the same thing. They were also defeated, and after they overthrew their government in Portugal, they also negotiated the end of colonial rule. But in Angola, it was a bit messy because there were three main groups fighting in Angola. You had UNITA, which was basically supported by the CIA. The leader was Savimbi. And then you have the FNLA, which was also supported by the CIA and based in what was then Zaire, which was Congo. And at that time, it was ruled by the puppet Mobutu Sese, the puppet who killed Patrice Lumumba. And then, of course, you had the MPLA, which was the one supported by the Soviet Union and all the other African countries and Pan-African sisters and brothers right here in the United States, including in Harlem, conscious brothers and sisters who were involved in supporting the liberation struggle in Africa. So as a result of that, the new leadership in Angola was questionable. Who would emerge as the leaders? Because of the support that it was getting from the CIA and the United States, UNITA and the FNLA was about to win victory and take over the capital city and announce the new government. And obviously, it would have been a puppet government in Angola. At the last minute, the MPLA convinced Cuba and Fidel Castro to come to their rescue in 1975-76. And Castro sent thousands of soldiers, sent artillery guns, and they fired against FNLA and UNITA and pushed them back. And the MPLA was able to declare the first government of post-colonial Angola under Dr. Agostinho Neto. And then finally in Guinea-Bissau, the other Portuguese colony. That struggle was led by the great Amilcar Cabral. Cabral is C-A-B-R-A-L, and I spell it for young sisters and brothers who may be interested in doing more research to find out about Cabral. He was an intellectual, highly educated. His expertise was agronomy. And if you listen to his speeches or watch him on some of the film available on YouTube, you think you're listening to a university professor. And he said, we are not military people or militants. We are not. We are just militants who are armed because we want to end colonial rule. But we are not military people. And once this war is done, we're going to go back to our regular function after we drive out colonialism. Unfortunately, the Portuguese also got to Amilcar Cabral. 1 year before they declared independence, the Portuguese, working with Africans, African traders.
I sent you an invitation.
And he was brutally assassinated. He was shot multiple times and killed. And his brother took the leadership. And Guinea-Bissau was able to win its independence. And then the last two I want to mention, of course, was what was then Rhodesia. And Rhodesia, people are much more familiar with that struggle, with the Patriotic Front, led by Robert Mugabe and Joshua Nkomo. And they were able to defeat the apartheid regime in Rhodesia, which was run by Ian Smith, a European who claimed he was prime minister, and he was supported by the of defeat. In 1979, Britain, as I said earlier, the crafty British, once again said, let's talk. And they invited Nkomo and Mugabe to London, and they negotiated the post-colonial state in the new nation of Zimbabwe. And one of the conditions in the new constitution was that some of the parliamentary seats would be reserved for Europeans, exclusive for Europeans. And the land, as part of that agreement, would not be expropriated from the Europeans. So the Patriotic Front agreed to those conditions because the British also committed to providing the money to buy the land back from the Europeans. And the United States also pledged money when Jimmy Carter was president. But all this changed a few years later. The money never came, and ultimately, Mugabe's government had to seize the land and return it to Africans. And then the final front line of the war against colonial rule, of course, was South Africa. And in South Africa, as we mentioned in our previous discussion, the contribution of Cuba, as well as of sisters and brothers in this country, made the dramatic impact. Back in the day, young sisters and brothers in this country started demonstrations and protests on campuses against businesses that were doing business with South Africa and empowering the South African regime. Groups like TransAfrica, you yourself, Brother Clemson Brown, you were involved Ilombe Brath was involved, and that was that part. And then the other part, of course, was when Cuba once again came to the rescue of Angola, this time in 1987, when South Africa once again had invaded and occupied Angola and was still trying to support UNITA under Savimbi once again to seize power in Angola. This time, Cuba came with overwhelming force, thousands of soldiers, Air Force, artillery, and dealt the South Africans a decisive defeat and forced them to withdraw not only from Angola, but from Namibia as well. And that is how Namibia won its independence in 1990. And Nelson Mandela was also released in 1990. And by the way, that battle is called the Battle of Quito Quanaval. And I also recommend and urge sisters and brothers to do the research and watch some of the documentaries about that battle on YouTube. A decisive victory against colonialism in Africa. Mandela, as I said, was released in 1990. And then in 1994, South Africa had the first election where everybody was free to vote, not only Europeans. And Mandela became the first president of an independent South Africa. I don't count all those years when the country was run by Europeans as independence. To me, South Africa's independence begins in 1994, when Mandela became independent. So my final comment on this whole issue of liberation and independence in Africa is this. Because at the end of the day, the former colonial powers were still involved in negotiating the post-colonial state. Africans were shortchanged. Africans were shortchanged. Independence did not go all the way. So today, in pretty much every African country, we have an educated African elite in partnership with the former colonial powers in Europe, and now with China as a new player on the scene. They are now allies with these former colonizers and exploiting ordinary African citizens. So the ordinary Africans, the peasant farmers, the students, the workers, they now have two enemies. The number one is the enemy in Europe, and number two is the enemy in Africa, the so-called African leader, who instead of operating the country on behalf of the interest of Africans, is operating sort of like an African governor on behalf of Europe. So we no longer have European governors in Africa, but we have governors in black skin. And that is the tragedy that Africa faces today in the 21st century. And when an African tries to challenge that system and says, no, I want to be an African president on behalf of Africans, Europe doesn't like that example. Capitalism doesn't like that example, so he's killed. And the best example of that was Thomas Sankara. When he came to power in Burkina Faso in 1983, the country was called Upper Volta. He said, what kind of name is this? What does Upper Volta mean? Burkina Faso means land of the upright people. We will stand up erect and we won't bend our backs to anybody. So that is why we'll call ourselves Burkina Faso from now on. And then he started asking some very important questions that every African leader should ask. We have been growing food for centuries. Why are we now importing food from Europe? How does that make sense? He said, that is the definition of imperialism, when you don't grow your own food. We've been making our own clothes. Why are we importing clothes from Europe when we know how to grow cotton? We are the ones that are growing cotton for them to make clothes. So why are we importing clothes from Europe? Why are we waiting for Europeans to build hospitals and schools when we know how to build? Why are we standing helplessly and watching as the desert is creeping on our land and eating up our farms? Why can't we plant trees? They planted 10 million trees. They built clinics. They built schools. He said, why is the army used to exploit the citizens? We need this to be a people's army, not just a men's army. He recruited women into the army and trained women to become soldiers and created a truly people's army in Burkina Faso. And then he asked this one question, and then ultimately he paid with his life for this final question. He said, why are we paying all these billions of dollars in debt payment and interest payment to Europeans? He said, first of all, some of this debt we inherited at independence. And a lot of people don't know this. When African countries became independent, the Europeans who were leaving said, by the way, while we were running the country, we incurred some debt on your behalf. So now that you're the new leadership, you're going to have to be responsible for paying that. He said, how can we be paying such a loan incurred by colonial regimes? And loans given to African countries where the leadership was a dictator killing the people, stealing money, like Mobutu in the Congo, for example. He said, let's renounce this debt so we can use the money to build our own countries. But if I say it alone, I won't be alive to attend next year's meeting. This was in 1987, in July, at the Organization of African Unity meeting in Addis Ababa. He said, but if we say it collectively, there's no way can they assassinate more than 50 presidents. And this is a very interesting speech, and it's available on YouTube. If people go on YouTube and they search Thomas Sankara, and Sankara is spelled S-A-N-K-A-R-A, Thomas Sankara, Organization of African Unity speech. That speech will pop up. It's in French, but it's subtitled in English. And you see the African leaders nodding and agreeing with him. But none of them stepped forward to support him. And his prediction came true much, much earlier than he had anticipated. In October 1987, he was killed by his so-called best friend and number two man, Blaise Compaoré, at the behest of the French and French imperialism. And that is the sad situation that Africa faces today, continent run by neocolonial regimes. When a leader like Sankara tries to step forward to change things, he is cut down. Patrice Lumumba was cut down. Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana was overthrown by the military with the involvement of the Central Intelligence Agency. And that is where Africa stands today. That is where our beloved continent stands today.
Thank you, Milton. Mark Dunston, I think, has a question. Mark, are you there?
Yes,
Yeah, Mark.
hello. Hello, do you hear me?
Yes, great. Yes.
Okay.
Move your camera screen down so your head would be more to the.
Okay.
Okay, good enough.
All right.
All right, go ahead.
Yeah, it's good. It's good to hear from you, Mr. Allimadi.
Thank you, brother.
With reference, I'm sorry for getting here late and missing what was mentioned earlier, but there was a recent event that took place where there was a press conference between the French President Macron and the Ghanaian President of, I believe his name is Akufo.
Yes.
Yes, and after Macron gave all of the complimentary rhetoric about how great of the cooperative relationship is and will be between France and Africa, Akufo basically put him on point by stating that they will no longer, they're going to change the relationship and trade with regard to cocoa. Cocoa being a major export of the country. and that he basically said during that press conference that we're going to develop our own enterprise as far as producing our own cocoa and having it as a commodity as opposed to just sending it out to France. Now, in light of what you just said, in terms of debt, in terms of the oppressive, coercive nature of of um, of Africa and the European nations under colonialism, along with their lackeys. Um, is this something that we need to pay attention to and keep a close eye on in terms of what happens with Ghana? You know, with this declaration that Akofu just made.
That you raised that issue, and thank you for raising that issue, brother.
Okay.
I was just on another show about a month ago that is hosted in DC by a couple, a sister and brother that operate this show. And I brought up this issue. I didn't really refer to the speech by Macron and the response by President Ado. But I said we need to not be bystanders as Africans in diaspora. And I told the sister and the brother, I said, we're speaking right now. Why don't we do something entrepreneurial? Because what most African countries lack is capital. And most countries that accumulated capital, you know how they got it, by plundering from other countries. That's how Britain got capital to industrialize. They stole it and deprived these other regions, including Africa, of the opportunity to accumulate capital. So they lack capital. So we, on the outside, we can start playing that role and being part of that process of infusing capital into Africa. And we can start even on our own limited ways. So I said to the sister and the brother, I said, for example, why can't we create an enterprise and partner with sisters and brothers in Ghana who are growing cocoa, and we set up, a factory. It's not like, nuclear science. We set up a factory and we produce the chocolate in Ghana. And we start exporting the chocolate to the United States. Now, chocolate have name brands, right? So people know by the name brands. When they go and they buy Toblerone or Cadbury's chocolate, it's because of a name brand that they're familiar with. So it's very difficult if you're starting out your new chocolate, nobody knows the name brand. If it's sitting over there next to Cadbury, Toblerone, most likely people are going to pick the name brands they're familiar with, Nestle and all these other European companies. But what if we got some known Africans in diaspora? We got African American sisters and brothers who are known to become involved in this enterprise. So let's just pick names randomly. Let's pick Oprah. Why not have an Oprah brand chocolate? I think if you place this at a Whole Foods, people would probably start picking that brand as opposed to Cadbury and Nestle. Or let's take a person like LeBron James. LeBron is putting some of his money into progressive agenda now. Why don't we have a LeBron name brand chocolate that he can even, start promoting? Now we are building a brand that is Black owned, that is creating jobs for people in Ghana, for the farmers, for the factory workers, for the people involved in the export, and for the people involved in the marketing here in the United States. That's how we have to start thinking. How can we become a part of this process in Africa so that African countries don't have to go to the World Bank and the IMF, because those are the two biggest enemies of Africa. And why do I say that? Because when you get money from them, they give you some conditions. And one of those conditions is that you don't focus on manufacturing or building factories. And that's not surprising, because they don't want you to compete with the countries that are industrialized, like the United States, like Europe, like Japan. And these are the big shareholders of the World Bank. If the World Bank was doing productive work in Africa, why is it that since the World Bank started lending with the loans initially to Ghana in the 1950s, why is it that 70 years later, there's not a single developed African country? Think about that. So logically, you should realize immediately that the number one agenda of the World Bank and the IMF is not to empower Africans. So it's up to us, really, Africans in diaspora, making that connection with sisters and brothers on the continent. So that's why I'm very happy for that question. That's something we can start doing, but it's a tremendous challenge, because now we're going to have to deal with fellow African brothers, reactionary presidents and prime ministers, some of them who are going to be standing in the way in order to fulfill the interest of Europe.
One other question with respect to everything that you've just said.
Yes, sir.
Is there a risk that just like Sankara, that Ado will be isolated, that he won't get the support that he gets from other leaders, which will leave him vulnerable to covert actions to take him down?
Well, okay. In the case of Ado, I'm not that fearful. And because he's not gone as far as Sankara has gone. So what he suggested is very revolutionary, but as you saw, did it in a very diplomatic way, and it made it very difficult for the enemies of Africa to try to take him out. He said it almost in a business-to-business way, and the Europeans did not see that as threatening. But once it does start happening, then that's a whole nother question. So I may be answering your question prematurely. Let's put it this way. This is the best way to answer it. Since it's not yet materialized, it's not seen as a real threat yet. But should that example really take off and start being duplicated in other African countries, then there could be problems for him. That's how I would put it. But what he suggested is the right approach. And cocoa is only one example. I picked up a brand at Whole Foods of chocolate, and I was looking at it, and it said made in Belgium. Belgium doesn't produce cocoa. I picked up tea made in Germany. Germany's not growing tea, you see? So this is where we come in and do some positive intervention and disruption. And this is a discussion that we need to have, and we must have, and we have to get involved in.
I got a question for you. You ready?
Yes, sir. Thank you, brother.
First I want to say I do got the Neocolonialism, Last Stage of Imperialism.
Excellent.
Yeah, I watched you on the Luke Mon Nation. Yeah, and I watch you every time I'm on Twitter. Every time you come through there, so I'm always paying attention.
You got the right books, man.
Definitely. But so I just wanted to say, I don't know, it's like a question and a analysis. So people in America, when we do our political education, we seem to become paralyzed when it comes to capitalism. Right. Most people are afraid of being a capitalist, and we shy away from doing things monetarily. So, and how do you suggest most people defend their image or their feeling? How do people not become a capitalist and still participate in the development stages? Because, as you said, it hasn't happened yet on the land. Right. And how do diasporans connect in ways that this can go on? Like, would like a citizenship be required? Would a African passport type of situation be required? Or like, how people don't know how to do business in Africa, and we don't want to go there acting like you know what to do as a person. For like I'm in America, so I don't want to go there thinking I know what's going on the land. And I seen you said you're going to ask the people what do they need and meet them where they at. So that's what I wanted to say.
Okay, very good. So you asked very good questions, and thank you for those questions. So number one, the whole issue and critique of capital is that you have those that dominate and control capital, and now they control the means of production as well. So they determine how the resources are distributed, right? The profit, the goods that are produced. And that's the essence of how capital exploits, labor. So the way I'm thinking about what we can become involved is we would have cooperative enterprises so that the farmers are part of the ownership structure. The people that work in the factories are part of the ownership structure. So it's not just me and Brother Clemson Brown sitting here and saying, oh, we got the money, so so this is our company, we are the capitalists. So we're going to be exploiting Ghana the same way the Europeans were exploiting Ghana. We don't want that. We want a different type of enterprise where the producers are also the owners and beneficiaries from this type of structure. Now they have all the incentive to work even harder, because as the enterprise grows, it means that their own interest is also growing. Their ability to have more income and wealth, the ability to give a better standard of living for their children, and their children can become a part of this enterprise, you see? So we're building the unique kind of cooperative environment, not the profit is the bottom line European approach that has been dominating since the enslavement era in Africa. So that's how I would answer the first question. And the second question is very legitimate too, in terms of how does one even get to know about how to do business in these countries. So, and that is a very good question. Ghana, in the last 3 years, has become very proactive in disseminating a lot of information about how to do business in Ghana. So they're making a lot of information available on their websites, and they're obviously hosting a lot of events in Ghana and inviting Africans in diaspora to come back to Ghana. And I think, and that's why I think it's also good to focus initially on a few countries. If we get involved in enterprise where we're now bringing some capital to Ghana and creating these cooperative type of enterprises that I just mentioned, and then other African countries and leadership can see the example that we're doing in Ghana. And then they could start emulating the same model and creating conditions within those countries that allow us to now go to those countries and do what we are doing in Ghana as well. And then people will become more knowledgeable about that information as well. So there is some information now, particularly from Ghana. And obviously, if we do become involved, and when I say we, it's just not me, you, and Clemson, it's we in diaspora in general. More people will get to find out about how it's done as well. And then finally, in terms of the citizenship, Ghana is making it easy for citizenship for Africans in diaspora. And increasingly, it goes back to when other African countries see how it's succeeding, then they also will be inspired to duplicate what they're seeing happen in Ghana. And then finally, the African Union itself is also in the process of implementing the African Continental Free Trade Area. It's already signed into law, and officially it was launched on January 1st, 2021. But because of the COVID pandemic, that process has been slowed. And there are also plans, of course, to have an African passport as well. And as they also see the example of Ghana, and if they see it functioning, then there's also going to be incentive to make that passport also available to Africans in diaspora. So thank you for the questions. I think you're muted, brother.
Yeah, Minister Brown, you're muted. No one.
Okay, what about now?
Yeah,
I can hear you now.
Good.
Okay. The final question, if no one else has a question. Bunny, are you there? Yeah, Bunny, you have a question? Okay.
I did see one question on chat. Somebody posted a question on chat.
Is there a lady in there with a white dress on named Brandy? Did you ask her Brandy there so I can tell her all I want?
No. Nobody here has a white dress on. The final question I'd like to ask you, when you look at Africa,
yes, sir.
There's not one country in Africa that militarily can defeat the West, including Israel, which is a part of the American military apparatus.
Right.
How does Africa, because before now, Africa has decisively, with the help of Cuba, defeated several powers that was oppressing African people. Those in Angola, those in South Africa, many African countries put up military struggle. But in light of the technology that Europeans exhibited from the beginning with the gun, and now they have only increased that military technology. How does Africa then struggle back? Does it continue to struggle the way it did with South Africa and Namibia? How do they fight back?
All right. And thank you for that question. That also is somehow related to the question that has been posted on the chat. And that question says, how can we stop good leaders from being assassinated? Collective unity is the only way, but corruption is like a cancer. So that was the comment posted on the chat. And that is absolutely the answer. You know, without unity, there's no possibility. And that is what Nkrumah said when he wrote his book in 1965. Neocolonialism, the last stage of imperialism. He said, let's form a United States of Africa with a united military command, with a united federal government, with a common currency, with a common foreign policy, like common transport system. And if we do that, no outside country will be able to attack or invade the African United States of Africa. And that remains true today. And that to me is the best solution, because if you have a United States of Africa, then first of all, you have automatically one of the most powerful militaries in the world. Obviously, now you can't compare it to Israel anymore. Israel would not be able to defeat it. Yes, Israel has nuclear bombs, but when you start dropping nuclear, you can't confine where it's going to destroy. If you destroy the entire continent with nuclear, it means you're destroying the entire world as well. You see? So unity automatically brings power. Now you're in a position to protect your resources. Now you're in a position to demand that you get a more fair trading system, where you're not selling raw materials and buying electronic equipment, pharmaceuticals, automobiles, planes at these tremendously inflated prices compared to what you sell to the rest of the world. Because now you're united, you speak with one voice, you're able to say, this is how much you're going to pay me for my cobalt. This is how much you're going to pay for uranium. This is how much you're going to pay for coltan. This is how much you're going to pay for copper. And if you don't want it, too bad. You see? And now you're using some of those minerals and the metals to manufacture within Africa. And now you're building factories in Africa. And now your military is becoming much more sophisticated now, because now you're building your own weapons as well. So at the end of the day, the answer goes back to what vision and dream that Kwame Nkrumah and some of the early founding leaders had for Africa, which is a United States of Africa. And I think we need to take a much more demanding and militant attitude toward this demand. And what do I mean? In the 1960s and 1970s, Africans in diaspora, sisters and brothers in this country, made an uncompromising demand that we must have independence in Africa. Europeans must leave. Africans must rule Africa. As Marcus Garvey had said, Africa for Africans. Now we have to make that demand again. Africa must unify, because so long as Africa is not unified, it means Africa is not for Africans. So regardless of whether we see African, Black presidents or prime ministers in Africa, we have to start seeing them as Europeans, really, because they're not serving the interests of Africans. Yes, they may be having Black skin, but they're operating like Europeans. So let's start treating them like Europeans and demand African unity. That is the only way Africa can protect its resources, and that's the only way Africa can protect its citizens as well.
Finally, are there any questions anybody would like to ask Milton before we terminate this?
Very good. I see a question that has been posed, and I'm glad that question was posed. I have to thank you for that question. It's posed on the chat by Dunstan, and the question says, what would be the environmental impact of this level of industrial development have on Africa? And I agree with him 100%. The industrial development that we can undertake now would be different. We can now move beyond fossil fuel, for example, and start focusing on clean energy. We have abundant sunlight, so we can harness that for clean energy. We have abundant rivers and lakes. We can harness that for clean energy. The Congo alone has enough water to provide energy for the entire African continent. So I agree with you. The type of industrialization that should be carried out in Africa should not be the same type as the one that has destroyed Europe and China and much of the world. So thank you for that question. That's a very important question to keep in mind as we develop Africa.
Well, final question, Milton. You mentioned China. What is that that relationship with Africa and China? Is that just another exploitive nation exploiting Africa? Are there benefits that grow out of that relationship as opposed to the U.S. and European relationships with Africa?
Yes. So thank you for that question. Yes, there are benefits, such as they're actually building infrastructure. They're building roads, they're building bridges, they're building railways. In some places, they build hospitals, they build schools, and they've loaned significant amount of money to African countries. So that's the difference between China and the West. But unfortunately, China is not imparting technology to African countries. So it means at the end of the day, the African countries are still dependent on China's managerial skills and on China's capital. So that even though an African country like Zambia could get millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars from China for its copper, the copper is still being shipped raw to China to manufacture products in China and not in Zambia. So at the end of the day, sometimes you have to be willing to bite the bullet a little and say, okay, China, you're offering me $500 million for this amount of copper. This is what I want. I'll take $300 million, but I want $200 million to be in technology, in value of technology, so that in 5 years' time, I have factories now to produce products from my copper to be consumed here in Zambia. And if I want, I can export the manufactured product out of the copper to the rest of the world. So Zambians are now benefiting from their resource by consuming it, but now they're benefiting by exporting it, not as raw copper, but as products, various types of products manufactured from the copper.
Milton, I want to thank you. It's been marvelous again, and I look for the next chapter in the series. Looking forward for it.
Thank you, my brother. Much appreciation. And to all the guests and the colleagues who also posed the question. Thank you so much, brother.
Thank you, Milton. Peace.
Okay. Stay blessed.